Thanks very much. And I'd like to acknowledge all of the other speakers that have been at this summit who have spoken to cybersecurity issues, and acknowledge that a lot of those people have a much deeper experience in that field than I do, but I have had some, and I'll speak to that in a minute. What I'd like to give is a different sort of set of perspectives, and it's really around the policy and legal intersections with cybersecurity. And I'll be providing that from a regional perspective, and I hope some of what I've got to say is of relevance, because a lot of these issues are global, and I think there's a lot of interdependence and similarity that we can look to. Okay, well, here in Australia, basically the entire population has become extremely attuned to cybersecurity issues as a result of a number of very big hacks that happened at the back end of 2022. The first of those was really in relation to one of our very major telco providers. So you've got a company that provides services to, say, half the population, and they were badly hacked. They didn't handle that hack terribly well to start with, but they sort of muddled their way through it. In any event, it exposed everyone to just how insecure they were. And there was a very public process of negotiation between the hacker and Optus in an attempt to blackmail them, which was unsuccessful, to pay up. As a result, of course, a lot of that data was leaked. Perhaps even more significant was a hack on one of our very large health insurers in Australia. And so again, about 10 million people, which Australia's population is 26 mil, so we're only like a big state in the US. A lot of people were hacked, and this hack was particularly problematic because it accessed and then leaked very sensitive health data about people, their HIV status, whether they'd been into alcohol and drug rehab, all sorts of things, advanced medical conditions, tied them to particular people and leaked them. And that was part of the process, again, of trying to blackmail the company into handing over money through crypto, of course. So the combination of those two, plus many other hacks last year, including hacks of government and private sector payroll data, meant that everyone was across just how exposed they were, and major class actions, legal actions were taken as a result. So those are still in train. Needless to say, this got everyone very upset. It compromised all sorts of data. It compromised passport data. It compromised driver's license data. And so the government was very involved with this, and also decided, well, we really need to jack up some of our policy and legal frameworks around these issues. But I'd just like to pull back for a minute and talk about the label that I put on this talk, which was cyber insecurity, and give you a little bit of my background in cybersecurity and contrast cybersecurity with information security, which I know is something that one of the other people who was to join us on this panel, Hamed, has written on. So I first had exposure to these issues over 30 years ago when I was working with our Defence Department, and they were doing work with DARPA and with other Five Eyes countries in the information security area, because that's what we called it. Back then, we didn't really talk about cybersecurity. So you see a couple of pictures there. One is of a physical device. It's a data diode, interactive link, or Starlight, part of the Starlight suite of products. And then next to that is, again, a fairly old picture, but one of essentially a network visualization tool called Shapes Vector. So these initially quite closely held defense projects, but then at least the device was commercialized. And so I got involved with that process and got fairly deep on how those sectors and how those products and systems work. And so we used to talk not about security, because we know nothing is perfectly secure, but about trust levels. And we talk about products and services being evaluated within a framework, within a context. And so you've got a target that's being evaluated for its function against a particular environment, particular attack. So it's quite contextual, quite contingent. In contrast to that, we've got now this notion of cyber security, and I wanted to pull that apart because cyber doesn't really mean IT necessarily. At its root, being a lawyer, going to the etymology, it means governor. So if you go back to Khyber, the sort of Greek root of this all. And security, I've contrasted those things there. And I've basically said, look, at the moment, we're just getting more and more insecure. It doesn't matter how much seemingly technology, education, policy, legal frameworks we throw at this, the situation is rapidly deteriorating. And so maybe part of what we've got to do here is, rather than try to slap a whole lot of panoptic controls on things, whether they're legal or otherwise, we also need to manage our own cares and anxieties about that insecurity and about our need to control things. Okay, I'll kick on from there. So what I'll cover is a whole grab bag of things. I'm going to move across them very quickly and lightly because of time, just to give you a flavour for how these things intersect and how they relate to this broader issue of cybersecurity. I'm going to also then close out with some comments about how there's an impact here, both across different sectors of regulation and business model, but also across countries, because of course it's a global problem, and close by making a plea for thinking about these things in a more interconnected way, both in terms of the intersection of these different policy perspectives, but also the way countries work together. And that may then throw forward into one of our closing sessions after this around cyber diplomacy. So lots of different ways systems can be attacked. And in response to that, in the legal and policy environment, we've tended to throw more and more laws, specific laws at these problems. And we've also said, well, we need more education. I was pleased to listen to the immediately prior session around cyber education. You'd see a very similar picture here in Australia. We're rapidly trying to expand the workforce. And I was pleased to listen to a series of interns from the Australian Signals Directorate, which is effectively our NSA, earlier this week. So very, very similar issues over here. The point I'd like to make, though, is in the face of all of this need to combat cybercrime and the various issues we have around online identity, safety, stalking, and government surveillance of these issues to try to deal with criminal threats and also military threats, we can't lose sight of human rights. And often this is set up as a simple zero-sum game. That we need to have more intrusion, we need to have more laws, and if you've got, the only people who've got problems with this are the criminals. Not really the case, and in fact, I think if we take a more sophisticated approach to this, we'll see that, no, through protecting some of those human rights and having a better policy approach, we can also improve security and we can reduce threats. So here's where I'll run through very quickly a whole bag of different laws. So you can sort of let your eyes glaze over at this point if you wish. But just to point out that here in Australia, much as in other places, we've intervened in a variety of ways, either to try to protect critical infrastructure, to enhance surveillance powers, or to put in place digital identity frameworks. And this is part of that sort of panoptic capacity to control, to intervene, to respond to threat, and to make sure that we know who we're dealing with online. But there is a complex balance to be struck here. And there is some pleasing development, at least here in Australia, in that some of these efforts are now being driven not out of, as they were, our Home Affairs area, which is effectively like your Homeland Security, perhaps, but from our Attorney General's Department of Justice equivalent. And it's an interagency approach that they're bringing. So they're trying, I think, to take a more sophisticated approach to the policy intersection. So lots of changes happening there. I won't drag you through the detail of all of that, but there's a steady expansion of these controls and of the capacity of government to intervene at the network security level within companies right across the economy. However, of course, that's very problematic because doing it effectively is a hard game and there are not enough people, skilled people, to do it. Still, they're making a big effort to do that and to do it collaboratively with industry, which is good to see. Some people, including large US companies, are not necessarily that happy about some of these controls and related controls that are meant to enable government to install backdoors or access systems. So that's part of the tussle I will turn to later about the power and control balance between government and big tech. It also intersects with privacy. So privacy issues here in Australia, as we'll see shortly, are not handled very well. We're sort of somewhere in between the US and Europe. We're nowhere near as strict yet as Europe, but we're about to get a lot tougher on these issues from a legal point of view. So again, lots of intersection with the issues I've talked about before, but also there are complex cultural and policy issues about, well, what really is privacy? What do we value? And some of this is culturally loaded. At the moment, though, our laws are fairly light touch. They really came from old school approaches to protection of government data decades ago. They were expanded to some, but not all, of the private sector. And they also included mandatory data breach notification more lately. So that's come in the last few years. And now it's compulsory for those things to be disclosed and disclosed quickly, much as it is in other jurisdictions. Well, it's been subject to a lot of criticism, and a big report just dropped this week. And there's a lot of change pending here, and very, very big penalties, because basically the government is extremely annoyed with what happened last year, doesn't want any more repeats, and is looking at a massive expansion, much more similar to the European approach. So you can expect to see big changes in our regulatory regime this year. And that's responding to issues around trust. So consumers have become rather disaffected by a lot of these issues, and those trust figures are old. So now they've deteriorated in the last year or so. So there are certain providers, and of course, social media and platforms are right at the bottom of this trust index. They've done amazing things for people. People have become addicted to those services, and they're very convenient, but they've taken trust and arguably some security issues also a bit for granted. Kept on operating in that move fast and break things mode, but haven't moved properly in terms of governance from that startup phase to being more grown up. And in response to that, we see governments everywhere, right across the world, intervening and responding with regulation to try to control that. I'd like to acknowledge this article, quite a nice one from a few years ago in Wired at Harvard Business Review, which talked to this need to move from the sort of minimum viable product to minimum virtuous product. So we need to build in more responsive, better policy approaches within the products as they're being developed. So it's not a retrofitted control, but rather companies being more responsible. And at an international level, the UN has stepped in with some guiding principles, and these are condensations of those that our Human Rights Commission used in a major report on artificial intelligence that issued in 2021. So recognizing that new tech intersects with human rights in many and varied ways, and we need to be careful in the design and marketing and release and use of those products in order to protect human rights. So things can be very, very helpful, but they can also be very damaging. And we've seen lots of downsides from privacy intrusion, Cambridge Analytica, political control, and so on. So in particular, that balance, I'd just like to move on to come back to this issue of the balance between privacy and national security. So that's an interesting intersection, and one that's proved a bit problematic for agencies of late. I've got a picture there of the founder of Clearview AI, and Clearview AI scraped facial data from across the web and then used it for law enforcement in America and elsewhere, including in Australia, to provide services back and help identify and track people. All sorts of issues with that in terms of what they did with the data, but also our federal police were queried because some of their individual people had used the product, even though the agency denied that they were using the product. So there was a bit of controversy around that. Okay, so where does this take us in terms of regulatory response? Well, as these products evolve, become more sophisticated, intersect across different regimes, financial services, social media, energy, telco, we have complex hybrid products. And what this does is pull the regulatory frameworks that deal with each of those together. And we've got quite a dance between states and businesses about how they each work together, harness each other, sometimes tussle with each other to try to strike the right balance in promoting innovation and services for consumers, but also protecting against consumer harm. Some very interesting work also being done, because laws are complex, right? They're a mess, frankly, in many ways. And this graphic plots out some of that mess. So we're trying to pull back and say, hold on, this is just too messy, too complex. And the way we draft our laws is too hard for people, let alone machines, to understand. And so we need to sort of strip it back, pare it back, less is more. And this is a visual plot of some of the actual conceptual language intersections between just a sub portion of some of the insurance that relates, some of the insurance and other corporations controls and financial and services controls that relate to some of these issues. So those can be valuable tools to use. Also, some other good signs. We can see here just a few very quick excerpts from what is a paper one of our Treasury has released on crypto, how to regulate crypto. So it's their token mapping paper. You don't have to read the detail of that. The interesting thing that I want to draw out from it is that all of these agencies are now saying, hold on, let's step this up at a meta level. Let's look at the policy issues that sit underneath this. Like, what really is crypto? So that's causing them to take things to a conceptual layer, and that's really necessary in order to effectively respond to issues without getting over detailed and having laws and regulations that only cover a portion of what's going on and become quickly outdated. So that's probably going to be a more robust approach. So some of this I've covered already. We've got these complex hybrid products, and this is causing change in the regulatory response to that new business model. One of the changes we've introduced here in Australia, it's a version of open banking. For those familiar with open banking, is our consumer data right. Here in Australia, that is not just a banking proposition. We're looking at moving that across the entire economy and providing consumers with the capacity to provide their data to other businesses to offer them a better deal. It's to reduce switching costs and intrinsic sort of sloth that consumers might have around getting to a better deal. So it's meant to make that easier, but it has some downside risks around cybersecurity. And some of those have caused the new government to pause the rollout of this program and review it a little bit more closely, because there are issues with providing all of this extra data to even more providers of services, given the issues we've already experienced over the last few years. So there are controls there are cybersecurity controls there, but a lot of those arguably are not tough enough. So that's what they're looking at the moment in terms of the data standards and the cybersecurity audit standards that are applied to people who want access to this consumer data. This is a small part of a much bigger picture, which for government is about connecting up and providing access to data to make things easier for people to do what they need to do in their day-to-day lives. But it does provide more of that sort of panoptic infrastructure for people to be tracked and identified online. And at the moment, that's being done through rather centralized identity approaches. And that clip there in terms of the accelerated rollout of these frameworks is from a paper article earlier this week. So these things are moving very quickly too. We've got to be cautious with those, however, because I'd argue that people are more than just their data. You know, they're more than just their digital twin. And we do need to be careful that in these processes, we don't undermine human rights, because that can also provide problems for our polity, for our politics, as the US has clearly seen in the last few years. Even more issues coming through once we expand these things into the Internet of Things. And so Australia, just like other jurisdictions, has been experimenting with how to regulate that. At the moment, we do that largely through co-regulation with industry. However, there's a recognition that maybe leaving all of this at the voluntary code layer is insufficient and intervention is needed. And so these privacy controls and other controls will have impact on those devices too. Okay, so let's move on from the more particular into the more general and acknowledge that there's been a lot of tussle over the last few years, especially here in Australia, between big tech and big government. probably didn't hear about it, but 2 years ago, Facebook shut down entire access to newsfeed in Australia and also disabled access to government sites, to emergency response sites, because it was unhappy about some proposals government had to regulate news links and some of the commercial issues around it. And this caused a huge furore, but in the end, government and big tech cut a deal. Of course, big tech don't really care about Australia because we're too small, but they do care about us as potentially a precedent for what happens elsewhere. So there was a lot of eyes on what we were doing from Europe, which has undergone similar issues in some jurisdictions like France and Spain, Canada, maybe even the US. Recognizing that, there's a lot of complexity here, but there's also a need for intervention. And so governments are much more inclined to go there if they can. On occasion, some industry players, we saw Microsoft attack governments before, but here, where they maybe don't have entry to a particular part of the market, we see big struggles at the moment between Google and Microsoft. If there's an angle they can use to come in alongside government on occasion and improve relationships, well, they might take that. This is a global issue, and it also intersects with geopolitical, national security issues, and the so-called splinter net. So Australia is sort of right in the middle of all of that, along with everyone else around the planet, and a lot of this multipolar strategic rivalry that's going down. But the point that I'd really like to make is, notwithstanding there are massive differences between the US and China, they're both dealing with these big tech companies and cracking down on them, not in exactly the same ways, of course, but in response to similar sorts of problems. We see some evolution, whether it's commercial or government, which, on some analyses ain't that different. And a lot of efforts locally in our region to improve cross-border regulation. So the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which the US was part of and then pulled out of before it was concluded, is a big deal in our neck of the woods, and China's part of that. But there are other measures sitting underneath that within ASEAN, Southeast Asian nations, and special relationships we have with Singapore to try to harmonize what we do in these areas. A lot of this, as you see from this report and the polling question, is driven by the need to improve consumer protection. So that really is a similarity across many jurisdictions. And so many places are dealing with this complex balance between how they protect people, how they protect data, how they provide access to it commercially. Some of us are still stuck in this zero-sum game about, well, is it economic progress or is it privacy? You can choose one but not the other. I'd say that's not correct. So lots of moves towards regulating things in different ways, regulating product release ahead of products going out, which is a big shift, bringing more of a human rights lens to bear, being more interoperable, and designing privacy and security in and recognizing the interplay between them. Also, a recognition within government that more laws is not necessarily better. More laws is just more confusion, really. So we need to move away from regulatory theatre, and I know that happens in the US too, where we're pretending we're doing something by slapping a law in place, but it's not really effective. And indeed, regulation can be a problem. Too much regulation is an issue. So we need that good balance, and we need laws that people can understand, not hyper-detailed laws, which no one can understand, not even the lawyers. We need to recognise that regulation is a complex blend of ethics, soft law like those industry codes that we saw, policy development, and hard law with many different stakeholders, be they industry, government, consumer, and citizen groups. So it's a complex ecosystem. And as we're rolling these things out around the world, we need to be very clear that there are differences in culture and approach that do impact on how we design these laws. So trying to rush to harmonization is a problem. We need to cool our jets a bit on that and let these things evolve. Because there are similar pressures on everyone, they are likely to evolve in a relatively similar direction, but at different pacing in different places that are more or less developed. And the regional cooperation frameworks enable some of that because they give longer time allowance to some of these smaller countries to put in place appropriate cyber systems and regulatory harmonization. I think we've got a lot more work to do here, though, to improve the way in which we recognize that, to give more due regard to social license, and to think about how we can give security not through simple panoptic global identities, but through more token and credential-based systems that are tuned to context. Finally, in closing, my last slide, I'd just like to recognise great work done decades ago by Melvin Kranzberg, really highlighting that technology is deeply culturally embedded and it's not neutral. It comes out of an ecosystem. It's got culture laced through it. And if it's deployed in different places, the same technologies can have very different impacts because this is a human process. And so we need to recognize the human side of what we're doing. That's really where I'd like to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for your insights on this topic. I don't see we don't have any questions, but so maybe we just wrap it up, but it will stay recorded for other people to watch.
No problems.
Thanks a lot. Have a
Happy to
great
help.
day.